Hello everyone, today we talk about the Byzantine tributary system, tax collection, but political domination of course, and the internal way of producing, right? That is of course very different from the one of our time, but also other medieval economies. Today we will not make these comparisons, but we have made so many videos about Byzantine society already, and about the Latin-Germanic one of the same era, that we have come to learn in many ways how the Byzantine world over time was definitely not a more dynamic system than the Western one, and that surely over time this did produce a problem. It's a huge, if not possibly the most hotly debated topic by Byzantinists, by historiography, given that not just the empire fell to the Westerners at some point, but the same happened at the end of a long process of de facto Westernization, and or at least feudalization, that definitely impacted not much, say, Byzantine society as a whole, that remained also in later times relatively stagnant, especially compared to the West, and declining, right, to other systems. But that had been taken as such in consideration by the same imperial authority, namely the Komnenians, especially Manuel the First, who likely understood that a system of privatization more directly similar to the Western one would have been more effective to some degree. Again, these are strong statements that, again, however, are still like a 50-50 as far as the aforementioned debate is concerned. Today we want to see, of course, how this system began, why I already made many videos about late antiquity specifically, and also the early Middle Ages, the passage from the villas to the kurtas, especially in the West. In the Byzantine Empire you have a bit more of conservatism regarding to that. Not that those mechanisms wouldn't happen, actually there are much greater similarities than otherwise. However, the fact that the East, even before the end of the Western half, had always been characterized more by some sort of more autocratic mechanism. This is true properly from what was in the distinction that we make between Roman and the Latin world, later the Latin-Germanic one, so across the ancient medieval times, and probably the Greek-Byzantine one, right? This is an incredibly important distinction that for some reason people are still scared to make. I made plenty of videos explaining why, for example, the concept of the Byzantine, the terminology at least of the Byzantine world, is fully understandable, motivated, and just exemplified as such, given the fact that the single greatest experts in the world are scholarly known as Byzantinists, right? They're just self-styled like that, and of course you can't quite liquidate the concept of the Byzantines simply because it's not the official name was used at the time. All this strange sort of nominalistic heresy, devoid of any historical scruple, without realizing, even if it were for the fact that the West, yes, had this sort of different ideas about Constantinople over time, but still why, right? And it is not a myth, it's not something, for which you can say there was no difference between what the empire was before and after. And if you still are stuck there, not just there are my videos, but just know that it doesn't help much, even just in the historical accessibility of the concept, right? Because as a PhD in medieval history, that has always taken all the possible chances to take, in fact, Byzantine classes at university back in the day. Well, I developed even more the sense of how much, in fact, the Byzantines were so, right, even as an approximated term compared to the Romans, at least in ancient times. And I have, again, hundreds of videos about Byzantine history, which I also explain why. And this may be also one of them, at least in part. Because the problem, looking especially at things like the tributary system, is that you must compare, right, this what was going on in other lands, right, say in the Caliphate, in Western Europe, etc. And this is not always easy to do, let's say in a quantitative way, in a numerical fashion, so that you can explain, other than conceptually, what this was about and how it concretely differ. Of course, there are in-depth economical studies we can look at that tell you the differences. We already saw, for example, like how much the Italian maritime republics took advantage of the situation in the empire, how much and why, right? What is that fundamentally, even with a strong centralized backing, that was still privatistic in many ways, there is no doubt, was still ineffective, was still not competitive, and essentially ever more deteriorated by the situation about that. Of course, there doesn't have to be a teleological determinism, and that's in fact where most of the debate revolves around. Let's say, could the Byzantine Empire survive, say, intact without a fourth crusade, etc.? Well, these are discussions that I don't like very much, at least in the alternative phase. Like, I know that there are lots of what ifs, etc., but as a historian, I always rejected that, because unless it's a way to say, like, what will happen in the immediate aftermath of that, as a general exercise to see how much you know, you can't quite predict what happened. And on the contrary, you have what actually happened in reality, which is already much more complex and complicated than one normally thinks. That is, in this sense, also much more interesting and really happened, so that traces were left, evidence for us to study, etc. So it's what we're still, in fact, hotly discussing. Because, I'm not a Byzantinist, but it's a big deal. Now, there is also not a problem. For example, there are studies by Halden that I very much dislike, because even though the guy is quite famous for his scholarly knowledge about the Byzantine Empire, etc., he uses disgustingly Marxistic terms, mental categories, and it's ridiculous to read certain things written in that fashion today, and I frankly would trash a good 40% of that. But of course, the 60% is still worth reading. But very often, besides all, again, the complications that we have in order to understand what concretely happened in these past wars, you stick some sort of ideological, let's say, historical materialism, etc. It becomes, and even, polluting the language with the various categoristically, definitions of structuralism, etc., is ridiculous, especially if you want to teach younger people what this world was really about, and how in that essence, so coming back to the aforementioned topic, it was not a radically or dramatically different system from other countries. It's just the degree of that is much more important. I think that the single most important factor to look at how, say, the Byzantine tributary system worked is considering that, first, here we see continuing a de facto centralized state on the ancient basis, right? So of course there are shrinkings, decline, privatization, public collapse, territorial losses of all sorts, etc. However, and of course you have to necessarily explain from a moral point of view what happened there, why the thing stuck together, because it could simply end at some much earlier than it did, as most powers, telling you the truth, always. But it also has to do with the degree this system had maintained control for centuries on essentially the single most late antique, if not properly late antique, or at least resembling for how it had modified itself up to that point, system maintaining the presence of large estates, right, of essentially an oligarchy. The fact that, yes, this system at some point in Macedonian times, for example, everybody hears of that, was still struggling to preserve the sort of medium-sized landowner that would be the backbone of the imperial army, and so a sort of bulwark against the oligarchs and all this stuff. But aside from all the, say, superimpositions and intersections that exist at that level with the same imperial household, it was essentially developing as a state within the state, and still on a private model. And this system was, in the sense, apparently not letting go, say, towards the private fashion that you see instead mostly in the Frankish one. In fact, this very large amount of land in the hands of very few people was pretty much Byzantine in nature, right? And the existence of a state that could keep perpetrating this order, right, and that had even crystallized it in an ideological fashion in order to preserve it as unaltered as possible, and reiterating the fact that this was essentially the perfect world, the universal one, etc., does have its impact. In Western Europe, you do not find something like that. There is an incredibly much more dynamic thinking regarding that, other than just a much more, not just diversified, but also fragmented system that also develops much more updated statal systems later, right? Especially when the Byzantine Empire was taken over by the Latins, and that definitely shows that there were also different ways to make very interesting things. And so it's at that point that you can appreciate the anachronism and at least the fragility of the system at so many levels. Of course, we're talking about, say, from the beginning of the Middle Ages, naturally more than half of a millennium, so you can't equate and approximate, but if you're able to look at the longer term sort of axis here, chronologically, politically, etc., well, you can appreciate much better also why the system had remained the way it had, right? And always remember this, that the Byzantine Empire was truly Hellenic-minded as far as the, in fact, original idea of the Greeks, that even though being under the Romans, still believed that fundamentally they lived in the perfect world that only the Dorian, the Greeks could have created, and basically considering everything outside of it some sort of barbaric thing of sort that couldn't spoil them, is living dramatically, to say the least, by scale in the Byzantine Empire. So surely there was a lot of Roman Latin influence. There was surely also the a very strong Christian ethos or way to Christianity specifically, that all reflected the particularity of this world, that on the base of the Greek system, differently from the West, where the Romans had literally Latinized the continental dimension, was based practically and solely on the coastal cities. Right? This is what the East remains. I also made videos about some eastern province, and you perfectly understand that the Greeks had always remained separated from the hinterland forever. Like, there had never been in a Greek mindset anything possible essentially outside, a few tens of kilometers of their city on the coast, right? The hinterland, even very close places, even to the capital, etc., were in a sense completely different places, not just because they had been, for example, Slavicized to greatest extent during the migration era, but because they had always been that different from ever, right? The system was different, the environment in many ways was, but primarily was a matter of political and social difference that was perpetrated dramatically throughout the entire Middle Ages. So much so, by the way, that the fact that this Hellenic element had managed to subsume the idea of a universal capital in Constantinople, also through the sense of universal empire, Christian empire, had brought basically by the 11th to 12th century, Constantinople being de facto the only city in the empire. Like, you can't say Thessaloniki is something like that, was trying to escape the pressure of Constantinople. Basically, all the other cities of the ancient world had become towns, or at that point, and Constantinople had absorbed, with its naval, commercial, military capacity, the entire coastland. Right, so that while some provinces were very autonomous in some regards, they were so because they were still ruled by oligarchs that had their also okayaka within Constantinople, right? And for the emperors, it was the same. Crete would become essentially the backyard, the private garden of the Komnenoi back in the day. And again, I made really lots of videos about all the stuff, so if you're interested, please check out the Byzantine history playlist. It's really rich. We'll keep making videos about the Byzantines. So, this point, that late antique and Byzantine society was dominated throughout their entire history by a type of economy based on this tributary system that literally, in fact, intended, as we were saying just right now with Constantinople, the lands dominated by the empire as a sort of just immense latifundium that just this narrow elite would control, right? It's not so categorical. There were always, both in the East and in the West, even more in the East at some point at the beginning, a sort of course, a middle estate dynamic, like sort of merchants, sort of people who were free, especially in the cities before their decline with the Arab invasions, etc., and all the contraction of the early Middle Ages more in general, that really caused massive systemic and structural damage. But de facto, like just throughout basically all antiquity, because there is nothing really different, even how you see, I don't know, Germanic societies developing through late antiquity and early Middle Ages, they do not go toward, say, you never see quite a public authority, right? There is always a private system that keeps on expanding on the belief that was traditional at the time, that if you went under socially, you were responsible for it and you deserved it. And of course, much of the concept of liberty that you see among tribal groups, etc., it's only essentially the same mobster philosophy of we want to be free to do whatever the hell we like as little tyrants within our own spaces. That this was really happening everywhere, just at different scales. And so here what you really want to measure and appreciate is the accomplishment, like the stability. And of course, the Byzantine Empire is famous for such resilience and capacity of coming back against other against foes that were not capable, in fact, of replicating such stable sanitary system, and in this sense never overestimate the steppes peoples, for example. And so even the threat, yes, they can destroy a lot, but they can't quite simply take over a system like the sanitary one. So that the West is often considered, especially by those who tend to get into the Byzantinistic, fanboyistic fashion, those were barbarians, right? They were underdeveloped. We're talking about Latin-Germanic Europe. It's some of the single most advanced places still in the world that we needed to somehow downgrade, because we decided all of a sudden, and after the end of the Western Roman Empire, that all the differences that existed between Northern and Southern Europe magically disappeared, were flattened by a sort of stagnated misery. That's not actually the case, right? Throughout all the early Middle Ages, the West showed some incredible organizational, political, and military capacity. that goes in parallels in the ups and downs to the trend that happens to the Byzantines, the contraction of the 6th, the 7th century, etc., the coming back. It's all very much in parallel, also economically speaking. The same can't be said for the Islamic world, and again, it's just by degrees that we have to evaluate how big the difference really was. Now, according to the imperial tributary system, the majority of the surplus, so essentially the quantity of product that was not reabsorbed by the subsistency consumption, was destined to be collected by the state, that is the aristocracy, and essentially the imperial house is just the most powerful of the aristocratic houses, under the form of taxes and rents. Right? So it's a typically pre-industrial society, right? But let's understand better what the characteristics were also compared to other cultures, other peoples. So in our world, basically, the things work very differently than simply taxes and rents, right? The main difference with today is in the power relations, meaning that in modern states, the taxing system essentially redistributes a part of the surplus that has been already produced and distributed by those that different title control, let's say the resources, and those that essentially sell their working force, which of course entails a great negotiation, because there is a much greater amount of spread individual wealth compared to the past. So basically, politics is about looking at how much the system should tax and how much the rents should cost, and this passes all through the institutional forms, and that have to say, in fact, employ the surplus that is still a relatively modest part of the entire wealth. The Byzantine tributary system is something substantially different, right? Because essentially, really whatever was produced other than what was consumed for subsistence reasons went to the state. Now, this is not actually different from what was happening pretty much everywhere, meaning that the surplus, the crop rate on which it was based, and so the growth was of those systems was ridiculous, to say the least, compared to ours, right? And you could essentially work for a lifetime like a peasant, and not even realizing that even if you had been in fact lucky to survive throughout the whole thing, you had become substantially richer a little bit. It's been very, theoretically calculated that just on average could be a few points percentage, right? And that would go to the system. So you understand also how light the state was compared to ours, telling you the truth. In fact, taxes were proportionally, in a merely mathematical sense, much lower than today, except in comparison to the productivity of that system, they were much more impacting at some point. And the Byzantine state, as you know, was pretty rapacious, like most others, and also more bureaucratically structured to make this thing happening more swiftly. By the way, there weren't only taxes and rents as the forms of appropriations of surplus. There was slavery still. And as we'll see now, the definition of the term should be addressed more precisely, because, say, aside from the traditional meaning of slavery, but how can we distinguish it from serfdom at some point? As we know, even without looking at the Mamluks we were incidentally discussing yesterday, there are definitely some forms of slavery that are better in terms of life quality than forms of serfdom, and even of liberty and freedom. So the thing should always be looked at very carefully, and not to be seen, even in this case, specifically for these systems, that things were improving that much. Naturally, slavery had gone declining towards late antiquity, right? The sense is that as long as the Roman Empire had expanded, of course, war slaves had been just injected in like crazy in the system, and they had been successfully integrated, right? They had been profitable for the system as a whole. Slaves had always been actually a much more precious commodity than is usually thought, right? It is true that in this large, in the latifundia, they had been definitely, exploited in almost torturous ways by also former slaves that, of course, had always that sort of complex in their mind, etc. But the word was normally intended like that, like a huge hierarchically feudal order that so at the top those who had deserved by God-given right to win over the others, and especially in the case of the Universal Empire of Rome. The Greeks, as we know, had everybody used slavery. We just distinguished, let's say, the ways, right, the needs at some point. There were societies that didn't use slaves, for example, because they didn't have really a sedentary holding. They needed people from their own clans. I'm talking mostly about the nomads, right? But slavery, otherwise, in all sedentary society was very present. Tribes used slaves on a regular basis, etc. And just the forms in also of mindset would consider the slave as a human being, etc. We're all now we're changing over time, right? It was never fully denied nor fully accepted. Which degree, like, of course, this condition had to be maintained. There were, of course, regulations about that, but while slavery was continuing to exist also in late antiquity, it seems that in the 4th century, in the Byzantine East, let's say, had an importantly limited role. In particular, in the production of wealth for the dominant estates. This in part can be explained through the aforementioned presence of let's say, the control by imperial authority on the most, again, infrastructurally served, commercially oriented maritime, in fact, centers, very different from the estates of the hinterland that had also belonged to cultures that could be, again, very different from the Hellenic one. There is an abundant imperial legislative body that suggests how, starting around, in fact, late antiquity, the agricultural slaves began to transform themselves in different subjects. That is to say, in the equivalent of the coloni adscriptici, or of the serfs, right, that were formerly half free or free subjects, depending on, the serfs, of course, were not completely free, but still the colony here, as we will see, had some limitations, to whom in fact were assigned land plots within the large properties, and to whom was allowed every type of social activity de facto, except the one of essentially abandoning, going away from their plot. The legal condition of slave, that is, an individual devoid of personal liberty, obviously continued to exist, and the reduction to slavery continued to be a punishment throughout the entire Byzantine period. right? As we will see now, however, this change did not equate to necessarily an improvement of the living conditions of the former slaves. Yes, they were now recognized. It's a bit, again, what started happening from the 3rd century with Constitution Toriniana, etc. They were still... It's not entirely true that the Romans made Roman literally everybody after that. But when you realize that these slaves, of course, had belonged to Romans, the thing was substantially different than, say, okay, there were still isles of barbarity, of literal foreigners with different customs, and without Roman citizenship within, say, the various Roman provinces, as there were. Here we're talking about people that were, yes, being essentially assimilated to the colonists, to the serfs, simply because there was no, not because they were improving in condition, but because the colonists were sinking in their own, right? So, say this sort of social activity there, what do you think could be like in a person, as a person living in a farm, like as a peasant, and having still to obey basically the lord under the conditions in which he was working that land, right? And again, in times of war, of scarcity, of famines, of plague, etc. So all what struck, of course, late antiquity at the point, where the living conditions of the peasantry, so the wide majority of the population, weren't definitely improving. Also, just in potential, where would these people go? There was also the famous Capitatio Iugatio from Diocletian's time, that is to say, the increasing connection of, in fact, also the freemen that were, to land, right? The fact that they had to, the fact that those who in fact controlled them, the owners of the land, had to provide also a part of to the military, had to pay this very costly cannons, and manpower was becoming ever more crucial for the empire's defense, but also for say as labor force for those who owned those lands, right? So you understand, in all this process, the value of these individuals was just was sinking individually. As, however, you still wanted to preserve them in good condition as effective workers, as effective soldiers, and therefore not treated just as slaves, where you could have plenty of, and yes, were in that sense treated worse on many occasions, but that now we have to see also through the lens of the times. We're reevaluating, for example, to Christianity, the human potential within these individuals, the fact that they literally cost more, they became, again, more precious, the fact that, again, it was not just about the former conqueror before that conquered so many people that, could even spare them, kill them, whatever he wanted. And that had always been the case, even when, as you understand, the entire society was somehow freer, like in Roman times, then it would become actually later. This is the most important thing. Like as we were saying before, the aristocracy had always ruled over anybody. There had never been an actual democracy, especially in the Roman world. Nor they really thought like in that category. Actually, what we intend as the demos, and so the word democracy is completely antithetic to any Roman traditional value. It just does not exist, right? The lower element is weaker, and as such, it has to be at the bottom of society. And they were, right? Because just this mirrored reality in many ways. However, there was a further deterioration here again of the average freeman as well. This is valid everywhere. Again, it not necessarily means that people were living necessarily better or worse, right, per se. It is true that especially the freemen, depending on in which world, right. Here we're talking also peoples conquering others, like the Romans, the Greeks, etc. So there were different ups and downs. But definitely, say, in late antiquity, an average Roman didn't live better than he had been living a couple of hundred years before, right? This is obvious. And so when you realize that these people were equated now, because they were free, it didn't make sense to enslave them. It would have been like a perversion. There was still always an understanding that the potential of these people was remarkable. Also, in a social sense, their condition was sinking, and these slaves were now assimilated to these guys, not because they had improved dramatically their living conditions, but because now they didn't look so different from all the other people. And this again doesn't mean that this happened because there was a moral system or whatever. It's just this system had taken an enormous toll. This was happening everywhere, right? Everybody during the migration era was desperate, right? Enough to seize certain opportunities, etc. And aristocracies were rising over freemen in every single society, from the tribesmen to the nomads. We've seen them every freaking where. So this is definitely has moral implications overall, but it's also like the one of in fact, the aftermath of an enormous expenditure of forces, right, that had produced these results and that now was beginning to decline, just culturally and beyond. Now, however, the agricultural slaves becoming so closer to those people that had in theory been just renters tied to the land but not free, say slavery as such went disappearing as a concept. That's how it happened, right? And during the early Middle Ages, by the way, there were countries in which the situation improved, right? And this is not due to the fact that these were actually different from Roman times. Actually, the best living conditions were definitely in southwestern Europe at this point. In places like northern and central Europe, things weren't actually better, nor than in the south, nor than they had been before. To some degree, it's always debatable. And in any case, also in the Byzantine world, you have this decline, but also a relative loss of liberty of the individuals as well. So this is very often people that have, especially something against Rome, always want to stress this was the whole package of evil Romanity that somehow was unshaded, undifferentiated. Of course, never compared to the other systems, because otherwise that would show you how this was still essentially the best thing that existed out there. But it is different, in fact, within the same, what we call the Roman world. And again, the difference between the Latin and the Greek world is astonishing at this point. Because, just realize that the Hellenistic world before had been having this sort of, in the interline places like that would eventually be lost, but if you pick Egypt or Syria, etc., essentially a mechanism in which the sense of European liberty of the individual was practically non-existent, right? It had always been under an autocratic power in which just a few people had owned all the land, and the rest of the population could be, yes, somehow active. They lived in a town, but the rest weren't living in the peasantry, in the countryside. In fact, not really being well at all, right? So the Byzantine Empire does inherit a great part of that Hellenistic mentality. In many ways, Diocletian's and Constantine's reforms were, of course, working with what they had already in the East, right? It was somehow easier to control this system for different reasons, right? Also the fact that they controlled somehow more closely the international trade routes. There were some advantages in the, say, infrastructurally, etc. But there was also a fundamentally a price to pay for those who inhabited there, which is mirrored by, paradoxically, the end of slavery, right? Because it meant really that things didn't matter anymore in that distinction between freemen and slaves, because the standard was pretty much lower than before, and somehow in between. The rents and taxes, if not the intensive exploitation of slaves, seem to have been the norm of surplus collection starting from the 3rd century, right? Rents and taxes, though, not the intensive exploitation of slaves, seem to have been the principal form of surplus appropriation by the state, starting from the 3rd century, for obvious reasons, right? Everybody now was brought under a much more intensive form of exploitation, so that these were technically freemen. You could count those as, rents, taxes, essentially drawn from the population, while, again, slaves were not also that enormously available around. There still was, right? Generally speaking, from the least developed areas of Europe and the Mediterranean, slaves continued to arrive because essentially the tribal peoples who inhabited there kept enslaving each other and selling them to, of course, to the bigger system that had a bigger surplus, not just in absolute terms, and this system began to live also a bit more on its own, right? At least in terms of internal resources. And this is what essentially the Byzantine world would establish itself as. Domestic slavery was a thing. Also, slavery just on a smaller scale, employed by larger landowners, did exist. However, it did not influence, from their point onwards, this now dominant method of surplus collection based on rents and taxes. And even the still many, because there were wars of conquest here and there, prisoners of war that, in relative terms, again, were still a thing, however, in the world, often, however, obtained immediately at this point in assignation a land plot to work, and they were officially even exempted for a certain time from the payment of taxes, so that they could have the time to render their land productive. Think about I don't know how this had been actually a thing from quite a while, right? There were tribes that Rome defeated, and that they simply settled in places that had gone depopulated and or that were to be more productive. So the sense was that if you didn't have anybody now inhabited in those areas because they had fled, were insecure, etc., you would simply settle down. This is how even the same federati were gradually brought in, right, through the same concept. They would still essentially work for Rome. They would have been assimilated in one way or another. And at that point, if it didn't happen, it was mostly because the state declined on its own than actually the blows of these peoples in the first place, that were somehow fine to be part of the universal empire that was all one with the only traditional reality they could imagine, that had always wanted to live in, with countless amounts of these peoples that had been already become Roman by the time this even of the 5th century. The purpose being very clear: we don't have manpower and labor force to spare, so that even slaves of war must be transformed into Roman peasants. And this, as you know, was, for example, in Theodosian times, in the moment of greatest injection of Goths, etc. Probably the single most important point in imperial policy, ideology, and propaganda. It was, of course, a redemptional meaning of the function of the empire that had been working successfully and was also continuing in a consistent way. as it's evident, we are far from what classical slaves in antiquity had been, right? So it's not possible to say, in spite of the general worsening of the living conditions pretty much everywhere in this world, that these slaves, with the function that they had in the past, would have carried out this meaningful role in the overall production of the empire, and in particular that of the wealth surplus that had been traditionally connected with, in fact, agricultural work. So not just the largest, but also the one that, of course, entailed the greater amount of subjection of some masters and landowners and this working force. So this is evidently established already by the 4th century, right? The Constantinian system that we call, of course, this was going on just within the Roman state by itself. We say Diocletian did this, Constantine did that, the first, the law and the land, the second, the army and the money. Well, they did pretty much the same thing all along, because we're deciding to establish this, and this is the same reason why Constantine decided to move his comitatus to Constantinople and to start erecting a new capital, because they understood that, in that sense, that these presented, even just with the greater stability in that mechanism, while the West had been living with some perplexity this phenomenon, in spite of the development, the further affirmation of the latifundum, etc. The institutional forms that the appropriation of surplus could take on naturally varied. The private landowners collected the rents in money or in nature, depending on the type of contract or concession, and the type of also economical prospects that they could get from, of course, the selling of the product, because it's obvious that this enormous agricultural resources of the estates of the latifundia were at the heart of that wealth and power that, again, especially the Byzantine world in the coastal dimension with the shipping of this across the Mediterranean were about, right? Payments in nature were definitely more frequent, right? The sense is that an important part, like a third, a fourth of the surplus, was normally deputed to sustain the army, not even through payment, but literal, in fact, land plots concession, right? This is relevant because, of course, think about the limitane, think about this gradual process, also the provincialization of the armies, aside from the affecting the field ones that were paid with even another part of the surplus that could be, however, gotten through other means we'll see now. In fact, the state cashed the surplus also as form of taxes, also in money or nature, and or through a series of working services. For example, the upkeeping of the postal stations for the horses, or the extraction, the mining of iron, or textile production, all services that were evaluated on the basis of those essentially standards of value that were at some point dictated bureaucratically by the central organisms, right? So that was a great sort of capital control that tended to squeeze further the internal resources. And everybody knows, again, how heavy these this fiscal pressure was, and why also the system contracted, right? A great part of the reason why, after all, the Byzantine Empire, as the East went on and the West unhinged itself, it's not much because somebody conquered it, but because the overwhelmingly larger amount of population that lived there began to favor this mechanism, right? And or at least were feeling in a world that was somehow contracting that, say, somebody ruling from Constantinople could not in fact exactly be considered very close at heart to the well-being of Western province. And very often some barbarians that had been significantly Romanized and still technically thinking to operate on behalf of the Byzantine emperors were seen as, now a local thing, right? Just like essentially just an armed force that had let the Roman civilians to work to make the same state in part operate, right? So there were tensions from within the same mechanism. There were problems actually happening in the same way within, for example, the Germanic oligarchies that were trying, obviously, we've seen it the other day, for example, with the Visigoths, where we observed the social conditions of the peasantry, say in the 7th century, that of course had tried to preserve as much as possible the latifundium system. And so, again, different countries have different stories, and that's why I make so many videos in the first place. As you understand, the latter, say, activities, the sort of the most, again, the best infrastructurally served, sort of financially active and centers, which were the ones in which the empire had centralized dramatically, also shifting lots of resources from the frontiers, all the logistics, the same army stationment, etc., were the ones that had, as we were saying before, more differentiated means to collect the surplus, right? Also in a more properly monetary sense. This is very important because, of course, barter was gradually becoming an ever more important thing in other areas of the hinterland. For this reason, we shouldn't even underestimate how much this, again, even, you see, the disappearance of the term slavery doesn't mean that, for example, I don't know, somebody living in the Balkan hinterland in the 6th century was actually living in a much different way, again, or even a better one, of course, than before, right? Even if it was called a slave. So we get also in the Byzantine world a lot, also the sources, the evidence from these same, very, very often the same Constantinople, but again, that's sort of more specifically Hellenic coastal space, urban space, right? Again, Byzantine society is not as highly documented like the Western one. Many sources went lost, and this does speak, however, still for a world that until very recently and still today, like it's very different from the West, because it sort of began as early as before Christ, right? To see that, I don't know, the Balkan or the Anatolian hinterland wasn't as productive as the Gallic or the Italian one, right? So this is not really a matter of opinion in that regard, and you must realize that science is really often associated with the, aside from distractions, etc., the lack of an actual development. We tend to conflate a bit too much these aspects. Again, we've seen how really frequent the Romans, for example, colonized with Roman citizenry from Italy the entire Western Europe arenas, where the Romans really expressed their highest sense of the fact that the Roman was a true warrior from the 4th century BC, the militarization of the entire population, etc. Something, for example, you don't find in the East, because you realize this world had remained largely unchanged, and just Rome had been ruling over it and getting the resources from it, but just as it normally happened also with the empires of the time, not really molded it more than much, and actually expanding the Roman citizenry towards sort of more frontier areas that could be, in fact, were Romanized, also in language, in culture, way more than these that remain always sort of Hellenically, culturally Hellenic, let's say. Here the system was continued, but the interland was also very, very different from the Byzantine face as a consequence that we can't see through the sources. Consider that the surplus was collected in different ways as in different times. Just like even the pay for the army or things like that, it didn't happen just always in the same identical time, the same identical, let's say, cyclicity, right? Every once in a while, for example, an occasional contribution for the construction of roads, bridges, or fortifications was asked, or the request of providing for food and billeting to the soldiers and their officials, right? If you have to cross with the army one region rather than another, that is going to be an important difference. There were all political decisions connected not to pressure too much a region or another, but very often we're talking about through extortions and the capacity from the center to impose yourself with the army, its deterrence, its force, and sometimes you literally didn't have any choice, right, given the political strategic contingencies. The imperial messengers and officers were also traveling with their retinues that needed to carry out functions all across. Today, by the way, we talk about the entire Byzantine history, so it's a very, say, introductive video. But we see, of course, over time, things changing because it's a long time, right? But as we just said, the Byzantine society is not overwhelmingly documented. You have a few here and there about how things work anecdotally, a bit like in the ancient world, and then you go with it. But otherwise, we know very few. In the 9th century, and perhaps already from the 7th, the Byzantine state demanded the specialized artisans of the provinces the production of arms, armor, and other, say, items of military equipment, which tells you, of course, the degree of control that the center managed to exert on the countryside as well. Fact that the latter was not organized through, let's say, effectively, communal systems. There weren't, again, many big centers. There were lots of, say, villages, market towns, sort of, again, groups, even clans that had settled through migration that had reverted to some degree of autonomy, but essentially all the system had been subsumed by central authority with a centripetal mechanism that had really taken over the entire system. This is particularly important because you understand that in Latin-Germanic Europe the thing was very different, right? There were, for example, more active cities, also politically speaking. There was a sort of greater, spread of individual liberty, but still operating actively within a net that was somehow thicker of polities, of autonomies. So again, even there is a process of feudalization. Don't get me wrong, but the Byzantine Empire had this uninterruptedly without any sort of ups and downs throughout all this time, and also without too much variety. Right, this was true across pretty much the entire empire. It wasn't an era that you could say, well, this was somehow more. You can argue that Anatolia was somehow more important even than Greece. In terms of even the strength of some communities, the level of, especially before Manzikert, of, for example, a landed settlement of the soldiery, but mostly we're talking about the famous dogmata, the heavy cavalry that was still in the hands, basically, of the great landowners. So it's still a largely, again, latifundium system, right? In spite of the fact it had contracted also during the the losses of effectively half of the empire during the Islamic invasions and ones of other peoples. In part, such strong control on the countryside had even allowed the same Constantinople to literally survive as an empire, right? This is not the entire thing, but this statal control was deeply ingrained in a specific Byzantine mindset that had managed to convince the same population of the worthiness of the system of defense, etc. Naturally, the central government tended to, let's say, to stamp up to, in fact, later, like the 10th, 11th century, to avoid the entire system, to systematically privatize and feudalize. Right, there were communities again of soldiers, like true, again, at least village communities that could help the emperors counterbalancing the nobility, but that gradually also were simply just in between and below them, and even more so, right? So that essentially after Basil II, as you know, the situation was irreversible to the point that the Komnenoi decided simply to privatize. Albeit maintaining those central functions that the emperors had from Constantinople could maintain over the provinces, because there is also the centrality of Constantinople over provinces that were very often very far away, decentralized, with a big, I don't know, the Armenian frontier, or Sicily, or the Exarchate, or the Syrian situation was very delicate, definitely. You have different outcomes, and it's the different history of different Byzantine provinces that we have already seen in part on Schwerpunkt. Furthermore, it was normal to impose extraordinary tributes of grain and other food, while the military service, if it did not essentially exempt you from the ordinary taxes, that is to say, the both the personal and let's say on the person, the capitatio in fact, and the one on properly landed property, it however exempted from extraordinary taxes. This is important because extraordinary taxes, as you understood, happen in moments of greater emergence, including exactly the one in which you had to levy the army. So in theory, those military communities would be in fact spared to keep on contributing with what they already were essentially they were maintaining themselves with, was as essentially peasant soldiers that were working the land when not in service, but they would also hope to be rewarded by whoever enlisted them, because they could be enlisted by the emperors, but also by usurpers, noblemen, etc. There is, in fact, this is also the problem. Constantinople at some point creates a sort of Constantinopolitan army, and the nobility has this precocious private retinues. Think about the Bucellari since the late antiquity that were integrated in the same imperial army at some point, because they were just essentially contractors that had lots of land in province that would bring their own private armies to comfort the statal, right? So just to tell you how significantly eroded the situation had been at some point. There were also lots of foreigners settled, notoriously. I made lots of videos about Byzantine auxiliaries and observed how this was an incredibly effective way of just replenishing manpower and labor force for the empire, like for as we've seen from the beginning of its history, as other peoples did, with specific political and strategical importance. But this is often not remembered enough. How many Cumans, how many Varangians, right? Even how many Turks later were settled, right? How many Westerners? This happened in part even in Central Europe, as you know, in many circumstances that we've seen even in feudal realms, especially to counter the nobility at that point, because the sense is also that the armed guy is someone that can that knows how to live out there, especially the more savage ones, and that you can mobilize, because as an outsider is going to be more loyal to the emperor than this sort of this pack of wolves that the nobility constituted, as far as anyone would settle on their own estates. The idea is that you had to be able to defend yourself out there, and there was such a thing. Like, the military communities were often challenged also physically by the nobiliary retinues, and that's how they had been gradually eroded as well. Not always, right? But there was a tendency just to give way to the stronger, to put yourself under his protection. So as you understand, it's basically what was happening in similar ways. In that place, more institutionally based ones, because there wasn't quite a state north of the Alps. In fact, in Central Europe, in Western Europe. However, the characterizing element of all these forms of surplus collection is that they, without exception, were obtained thanks to coercion by themselves, right? I'd say there was, as we've seen, a specific capacity of the state to enforce these measures. Anyhow, there wasn't a world beyond Constantinople and the nobility that could have much of a say in the broader balance, per se, right? In the majority of cases, there was this mindset again that responded to the sense of a traditional duty of obedience to rulers, the simple persuasive force of the law, or again the threat, as we observed, of vexation from the side of the officials. It could be the ones of the state and the ones of the nobles, or even monastic institutions that were quite powerful, as you know, in the Byzantine Empire, especially before the iconoclasm, and the church that had an enormous power, as you know, in the Byzantine Empire, an enormous administrative development. They knew how to control their estates in a very effective way. They were incredibly developed for the times and places even. So when you look at Byzantine society, just like the Latin-Germanic one in the West, you realize that it was essentially an agrarian society made up of peasants and agricultural artisans that, as a whole, represented the only concrete form of wealth production, right, as a whole. They were, by keeping them so down individually and fragmented, you would have of course, this great capacity of controlling them, while the state had managed to survive various blows and invasions and strengthen to the point that could essentially concentrate this power here and there by keeping them down, and still most of them being controlled by the state officials, by the aristocracy that were on the ground, right, and had this important coercive capacity. Only towards the end of the Byzantine Empire, when the state was reduced to a few districts in the southern area of the Balkans and of the Aegean, you would see that commerce began to become a significant element of state economy as well. At that point, through the imitation, especially of Italian banking, that we're incidentally discussing just the other day, you would have some attempts, right, of emulation. Byzantine merchants that would never have the same amount of competitiveness, of, say, of wealth, and they were still controlled fundamentally by the state as such, right? There were surely prerogatives that they had before, but we see how the Italians had already taken over, but we're talking about the 11th to 12th century. And when we look at this situation, we're talking about the 15th, the empire was already reduced to barely meaningful political force in the Eastern Mediterranean. We're talking about the very last decades, and part of the reason is that it had been literally eaten up by the same Venice, Genoa, and other powers had profited from this. It's necessary to briefly think about the effects of this type of economy that produced particular relations between the state and especially the ruling elites, the military, administrative, landed, or religious, or sometimes even part of this together that they could be. So observing these relations between central authority and the aristocracy that would gradually be absorbed by the same imperial household, at least in the measure in which the various quarters, various okiak had a sort of guild almost that the major Byzantine, say the major houses of the empire had within Constantinople, shows, and that is very useful in order to understand how, in fact, the same state worked, right? How you can study, for example, the entire Byzantine history, looking at how the power relations between these groups changed, which conditions the crisis of power balance in which the authority of a centralized state held itself began. So this does speak of what is commonly or sometimes stereotypically thought of essentially a sclerotization of a crystallized system that had not been able to step up further to something more flexible, more adapting. Now, it's evident that both the state and the elites were interested in keeping up this economical system, right, where the social situation favored them, and the state, represented by all this imposing political and administrative establishment, had, of course, maintained especially such a large amount of surplus to be able to survive. Right, aristocracies could rise and fall, were essentially more unstable. Constantinople had managed to secure, through the imperial government, this hegemonic role fundamentally, but still required a large amount of resources to be maintained. Many of them would gradually be privatized, as we were saying before, with essentially the okiak in Constantinople controlling basically all the empire. Right, every house, noble house, had its own possessions outside, but they, of course, had their foothold in Constantinople, and they participated to imperial policy around the court, the palace, etc. This was obvious, right? And that's how the system, in fact, was based, and it was, impressively built in this regard, right? There was the historically necessary tenants of functionaries also entrusted with the task of collecting the surplus around the empire, backed by, in fact, statal power, that would, however, develop, albeit gradually, an autonomous base of power on their own, right? And so becoming somehow competitive towards the emperor, right, in the statal system, what it had become at that point. So this is that process of gradual privatization and almost feudalization that at a point even the same emperors were looking at towards with interest, to say the least. Today we don't have the time to digress on this, but I made several videos especially about Manuel I's Comnenus, because when I was at university I had a very interesting course on, in fact, the empire of Manuel I, on the base of Magdalena's book, on that is essentially the most important on the emperor, and that really opens your eyes a bit on the relation with the Latins there, the West, the Frankish system, and how, of course, there was a lot of internal resistance for this state to be able to change, right? And the emperor said, well, look, if we manage to break the mold of this internal resistance, we can make of this empire sort of a big feudal one, and essentially attracting also elements from the outside that can help open the resources owned by the elites and say becoming more competitive and given importance to at least the capital of the empire would have remained central anyway throughout all our history. So this is an interesting mechanism, right? When you look at the governmental relations, the administrative cadres and those that effectively would appropriate themselves to the surplus materially would always generate such contradictions, because and potential antagonism, as of course there would be always the idea of who does control the resources first, who collects them, who has them under control, in which facilities, who's in charge there, etc. Right? So it was always very it's probably overlooked the Constantinopolitan dependency on this enormous amount of resources required to make the state function. There is no real difference, in fact, if not by scale and a level of administrative organization, between the collection of taxes and that of the rents, for example. But even at a much bigger level, think about the supplies required to feed the Constantinopolitan mob. In the East, they were traditionally extracted from Egypt, right? When the Arabs took over, the empire turned towards the Black Sea as northern shores for grains, etc. So there were incumbent pressuring issues that were substantiated even in the many sieges of Constantinople, because if you took Constantinople, the entire system would collapse. It's a bit like during the Ottoman Empire, right? Machiavelli observed that if you took out, everything was centralized, at least compared to other systems around. But if you took Constantinople out, like, everything would crumble immediately, because there was no other center that could administer that system. And of course there were communities provincially that would simply fall under, say, they would autonomize themselves, would fall under somebody else's dominion. The subjects in questions, by the way, could not simply be identified within the state as either, in fact, public figures or private ones, let's say, because an official and an aristocrat very often were the same people. Of course, there is a governmental elite that revolved also around the imperial house in the first place, and everything was closely controlled by the court. But there is an hegemonic estate of private noblemen that also revolving around the imperial palace were just also operating outside of it, far away, and sometimes just having very strong ties, even nationally, to the various ethnicities that they belong in the empire, etc. As you know, Byzantine history sees also these various dynasties coming from different places, always, in fact, competing with the ones coming from other provinces, because the meeting point was unavoidably Constantinople herself, right? You couldn't quite bypass that. And this, again, is always a double-edged sword, because you can have this internal infighting, usurpations, rebellions, civil wars, etc. But this was always to control the center, right? It was not to say, okay, well, I will autonomize myself to do what? To be eaten by, I don't know, the Caliphs, by the Crusaders, by the Bulgarians. It doesn't make any sense. Because, again, the most powerful area was the one revolving around the Aegean Sea, and the Straits in Constantinople was exactly the thing of the entire empire. There was no empire without Constantinople, and no Constantinople without the empire. The capacity to collect surplus obviously depends also on the capacity to limit the force of the politically competing groups, right? You have also resistance from the within if, say, those who owe you money are thinking that if they resist and they wait enough for, say, a guy that comes from the other part of the empire to weaken your local seigneury that has been harassing these people, you can break free. You have been harassing yourself, you can break free in the process. The sole true way to, however, carry out this, say, complete this objective was to create, say, an absolutely loyal governmental estate, right? Because by still making everything dependent on Constantinople, you could quite easily make it identify with the same imperial culture in itself. Again, there was not an alternative. But Constantinople, once you had that hell of a power concentration system, you would have been a fool not to use it. Again, this was true also for anybody, also for those settled in the West. The Romano-Germanic kingdoms were all working on the basis of Roman administration, government, low literacy. There was no practically other way to go if you could preserve it, right? If it was degraded, of course, it was difficult to rebuild it, or even but the influence, right, for managing, of course, lands were more advanced also from the ones the invaders had come, was just dictating this. The same goes from the within in the Byzantine Empire, because as we've said also in the various provinces, there had been peoples who just had also the autonomistic interests, but that they realized could be fulfilled by having their guy in Constantinople. And as we know, the Byzantine Empire's frontiers were much more pressured than the ones of the West, on average, throughout all this time. So this made it easier for the empire also to stick together through the Metus Hostilis, to realize that they were the last bulwark to savagery and barbarity, that especially from places like the steppes and still also from the Caucasus, from the same places, considering also how, as we've seen just yesterday in the video about the Fatimid army organization, all these groups of Turks and of other nomads were being employed even by the Caliphate, the arch enemy of Constantinople. Well, we're representing a deteriorated culture as such, because at least, of course, there were great civilizations like the Egyptian one, the Mesopotamian one, but overall, the immediate frontiers of the empire were in places like, again, the Danubian frontier, beyond which you have the steppes. The same Mashrek as such is somehow more savage overall, and in fact the Turks would settle in the Anatolian plateau, etc. So you're always under the pressure of truly more developed peoples that can vehicle, of course, the invasion of greater powers, like the Caliphal one that was essentially based on the Roman-Persian one, and so on the same centralized state. But that are also somehow, for the way they emerged, like more, let's say, and this is proven by the resistance of Constantinople, just worse than the Romans. There's no doubt about this, right? Constantinople survived all this long because it was a real civilization compared to these ones, and it was more originally founded, thought out, organized than what would happen essentially after the migration era in other systems that were not, let's say, able to stabilize, right? Western Europe, again, it was very sheltered, and so it managed, thanks to also the particular and unique alchemy that, as we've seen, also the dynamism and that and many other, say, spiritual reasons that the same Byzantines didn't have than, say, the Middle East. That, yes, lived its phases of prosperity, but it was also, in that case, because of Islam, that basically didn't have a church to mitigate the secular impulses. Always this sort of ups and downs, distrust towards earthly authority, and so wouldn't stabilize in the way he would have liked to. Right, this is true also, look at the Reconquista, right? The Caliphate of Cordoba was a relatively short-lived thing compared to the stability that instead the same Christian kingdoms were able to establish in spite of their feudal model. So these things do matter because they invest the same Constantinople, right? You have to look at the similarities there and the balance that the system managed to maintain over this incredible amount of time without apparently modifying itself, even though it really was, right? And observing that in spite of the bitter end and all the difficulties, and especially because of all the difficulties along the way, you actually have a very effective formula that surely had something to say on its own. The Byzantine emperors were capable of reaching such objective of creating a loyal elite fundamentally for a certain period. We should point out that it was not completely intentional. There were lots of things that were happening because of emergential situations, such as the one determined in the 7th century. Literally, the empire was halved territorially, and those who were within, again, understood the value of civilization and stuck to the system and managed to pull it off, to essentially push away all the threats to Constantinople and reaffirming this Byzantine hegemony in the region. It's also worth noticing that the Ottoman sovereigns would have tried much later to, say, maintain the same sort of loyalty by instituting the Devshirme, that is to say, the famed, unfamous practice to destine a certain number of Christian children to the army and to the administrative offices. This is true also for other ones. For example, there were Greek governors sent even to rule over decentralized provinces, because, let's be honest, without the local support of the population, the Ottoman Empire would have never existed like any other empire, right? So the most obvious evidence that it was the same Byzantines to open the gates of Constantinople to the Ottomans, because they didn't want essentially the Westerners to take over, is one of the harsh realities of what was going on by that point, right? And also the Ottoman Empire should be read more in function of this rather than just the thing just of the Turkish conquest. We were the Ottomans in the first place. Surely they weren't, very similar to those, who dwelled in Central Asia, right? So they literally emerged on the Bosphorus. They were Europeans, if we want to be concrete about they were Byzantines. This is the point of it all. They were already from within that system, and of course there was some external dimension, was also constitutive, identitary, essential, but for the sake of embodying a tradition, it could also in fact pose itself in a sort of master-subject relation with still a basis that kept on working imperially, juridically, and in part even by name, as a Roman one. Right? The Ottoman rulers styled themselves as Caesars. They styled themselves a lot of things, telling the truth. It was a Mongol tradition, it was a Turkic tradition, but also a Roman one, of course. This, by the way, the Devshirme was the same mechanism through which the previous Islamic governors had used, as we've seen just yesterday with the Fatimids and later the Mamluks, the slaves, to make a loyal and, in theory, super partes administrative and military, especially elite. So this power game was definitely, say, defining for Byzantine identity, history, and ultimate end, right? Because we cannot but see also in this compromise, or at least in the way we had been founded and maintained and somehow defended, the same Byzantine capacity to exist. In this case, if you look at the tax system essentially to the competitive models outside, right? In particular to the dynamism of the Italian maritime republics, but in general also to the same Western feudal system as a whole, right? That was in fact operating exactly throughout this thing, right? Look at the French, the Venetians, and how they established the Latin Empire. What is that each one wanted of it, and the fact that also the feudal continental element the Venetians didn't want to have anything to do with was also somehow, it was feudal, it was Frankish in nature, etc., but it was also based on what the Byzantine system had been. And we will have to look at that also a bit more in depth because, of course, the Latin Empire was immediately crippled by that atrocious military defeat at the hands of the Bulgarians that basically severed the wings of this project, even though the empire continued for decades after that. But it also had to do with another reality, a bit like the one that Crusaders had found in the Levant, that also had been a Byzantine land historically, like a Roman one, and so on. So, but consider even in that sense that paradoxically we've seen it again with the maritime republics, with the Westerners, with the Crusaders, of course, the fact that it had been the same Western Europeans were somehow coming back, right? The Levant had been, and Egypt had been conquered by Pompey, by Caesar, by Antony and Octavian. What happened during the Crusades, other than saying, oh, well, that was the land of the empire, who were the people who were conquering that, if not the same Western Europeans? That's quite a thing, right, to remember that. Remember always the differences between East and West. Remember always the differences between the Italics and the Hellenics. This is not a game, right? You can't mix the cards when it comes to that, especially after the end of the Mediterranean unity, of the end of the Western Roman Empire, and so the fact that you can't quite even say anymore this were a single reality, or one that we can simply identify arbitrarily with a sort of heterogeneized romanization, romanity. Romanity was a metaphysical concept, right? Different peoples lived within the system, and not all peoples were the same, right? And nor we can simply pretend that these differences were not, say, moral in some nature, and so that things happen politically for reasons that are too often, say, depicted in the catastrophistic way. The Roman Empire ended, and or just it was saved just by the Byzantines in Constantinople. Well, what do you think that was happening actually in Western Europe? Do you think that we're just, I don't know, wild barbarians riding the streets and raping people. That's not exactly what happened, right? Nor the world, say, the same Romanity culturally declined to a degree that could not be claimed by the same people who lived there, which has a lot to do, much more than it's usually regarded, but by the rise of the same Holy Roman Empire, which is not a joke, it's not a strange idea, it's not an accident, it's not a bad copy. It is actually a wholly legitimate thing on the basis of any traditional view, especially the ones that the Romans held in archaic times, that were definitely very different politically and more from the ones you see, say, at the time Justinian was trying to recover the West as a whole, succeeding, by the way, for lands that were most Roman, definitely, but that definitely met with not just a Germanic but also a Latin resistance, which should never be forgotten in this regard. I made videos about this, giving especially the Ostrogothic siege of Rome, so that's an interesting reflection to see that Romanity kept on living, right, in its in the place in which it sprang from, and there are just reasons of the last few hundred years for which we have been essentially induced to believe that this didn't happen, because you had to properly be erased of what the West was collecting as a legacy. But again, I made lots of videos about the Renovatio Imperii and on the papacy and more that are supposed to explain this also in depth, and it's not today's video's purpose. But hopefully we'll go on and we'll talk about this at some point. For today, however, I stop it here. We'll keep talking about Byzantine history. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.